text this week comes from the book of Galatians, and Galatians is a book that was written by the Apostle Paul. Paul, as probably most people know, was at one time named Saul, and he's a guy that was not kind to Christian people at all, persecuted them, basically, if you could, had them killed for their faith. So we've got this converted person. So Paul's kind of made this faith journey, and he ends up being one of kind of the heavyweights, if you will, of the Christian church. He's one that after following Jesus, and Jesus has been crucified, and we know the whole story of the resurrection of Christ, Paul is one of the big guys that kind of goes out into the world to spread this message. And he makes 3 long missionary journeys across kind of Jerusalem and that area of the world. And did you know of the 27 books of the New Testament, Paul is credited with writing 13 of them. So nearly half of the New Testament comes from Paul. So this is a really kind of somebody that would seem to have some pretty good wisdom for us and for people in the church. And he's writing the book of Galatians to the church of Galatia, and he's writing it from a city called Antioch. Antioch was probably the 3rd most important city in the Roman Empire, because it was right on a coastal area, so they've got a lot of trade going on. It's a very busy and important city. And it's in now they would call it modern-day Turkey. So it was Asia Minor then, it's Turkey now is where Antioch was. The interesting tie to older time Christianity was Antioch was the place that the first Christians fled to avoid persecution. So when the Christians are being persecuted, this is after Jesus dies, Antioch is one of the places they go, and Paul is in Antioch later on. It's after people have fled there, and he's writing to some of the churches from this place. It really kind of has some really interesting ties. And the reason that Paul is writing to the Galatian churches is there's people there that are saying we need to follow old-time Jewish law. And this is after Jesus has died, and they've got this model of what it looks like to follow Christ, and there's still people saying, whoa, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. We need to do what they used to do, way back. And Paul is writing to say, well, we can't discard those old laws, but there are better ways to follow God. There are better ways to be Christians, and that is having a faith in Jesus Christ. So then he goes on, especially in chapter 6, he's talking about how we need to relate to people, how we need to almost bring people back that feel kind of lost, how we need to relate to people that are struggling. And he says, brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks he is something when he is not, he deceives himself. Each one should test his own actions, then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. For each one should carry his own load. Anyone who receives instruction in the word must share all good things with his instructor. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So we're going to break this down in our lesson for today, but these are kind of Paul's outlining some steps, things that we need to do. I noticed that Lou stepped out, but I know he would shake his head in agreement. Sometimes when you prepare a sermon, it becomes something that like Like if I could set a mirror there in the back. Sometimes the messages that come from pastors and preachers become almost things that we need to say to ourselves. So I guess that's kind of what this message is today. And I hope that you'll kind of take this journey with me, because I think there's things in here that we can all relate to. The first thing when I started reading this text and preparing for the sermon, I thought, why would Paul be writing to people that were lost? And the answer is pretty apparent. Well, he's writing to the lost because they actually are lost. So I thought, what does it mean to be lost? If you're a person that has some kind of faith, what does it mean to be lost? And I kind of settled on the title, Mad at God. Because I think at the heart of it, that's a lot of times why people lose their faith, is because we get mad at God. And when I thought of that title, I've had several times in the last 5 years when I've just been flat mad at God. And there's times that I've come home from some of those calls and I've told Rita, I don't get it. I want to share a couple of those with you just because it gives, I think, a little insight. And I think anybody would be mad and question, but when you have to pray over the body of a burned 2-year-old who died in a house fire because his parents were more interested in getting high than babysitting, I was mad at God. Not too long after that one, there was a car accident where the babysitter did everything right. The kids were buckled in, but for some reason, one of the car seats, belt buckles, failed or wasn't clipped in correctly, and the 2-year-old was ejected in his car seat and died on the operating table as they tried to save him. Time I went home and I was mad at God. Got called one night. There was a drug deal that went bad. Somebody was shot. This guy was literally missing half of his head. Was shot in a car. And later on I found out it was a classmate of mine. A kid that seemed to be pretty good in school, so what happened in his life? Why would that, and then to meet that kind of an end? I was mad at God. Suicides always hit me hard, from our nephew to one of our friends, to getting called out and having middle school kids either hanging or have shot themselves in a park. Mad at God. The story about the shooting in Oregon. I don't really know the validity of some of the stories at this point, but I don't know if you all have heard them, but one of the stories that's been circulating around is one of the questions the gunman asked was their religion. And some of the reports are out that the people that said that they were Christian were shot and killed. Mad at God. I've got a bunch more stories like that. But that's when I started thinking about this. What kind of came to mind is just those real vivid ones that kind of stick with me. And people would say that this is a sign of our declining culture. These kind of events are signs that the world is in decline, that we're headed in the wrong direction. And I would agree that we're not headed in a good direction when we see these kind of things. But the reality is, this has been going on since pretty much the beginning of our existence. Some of the earliest records that we have of man is Cain killing Abel, a person killing his own brother. So we know that these tragedies, I don't know that what happens now is a sign that we're in any more decline and any more moving away from God than we've ever been moving away from God. But I think it's important for the church to acknowledge that being mad at God is a real thing. It's what keeps a lot of people from coming in those doors. pastors that have quit the ministry because they're mad at God. This is a real thing. And why this is challenging for us as people of faith, and why this is challenging for church, is we've got some rhetoric that we kind of utter as people of faith that sounds good to us, and it's probably, and I know it is rooted in truth. But if you are lost and mad at God, hearing some Christian rhetoric about everything's going to be okay, that makes about as much sense to the people that are mad as asking a goldfish to climb a tree. One of the ones that I often hear uttered is, well, heaven needed another angel. There's some connection there. I believe that person is in heaven, but you know what? If you're the person who's lost your angel, your response is, well, maybe so, but it's easy to say when it isn't your angel. That's the response. That's that real visceral response, because people are angry. It's easy to say it's God's time when it's not your family. And those things are rooted in truth. And sometimes they're going to come out of our mouths and we can't help it. But my encouragement today for us as church is to be mindful about how we are in relationship with people that are mad at God. Because it's real and it does exist. And then the paradox occurs that when you're mad at God, when those tragic, and like in Oregon, just those evil events that take place, the more those things happen, the greater tendency we have to pull away. And people that are already lost see those events and they go, see, that's more proof about why I move away from God. And we've kind of said that we want Breakthrough to be this outreach, the worship gathering that you're in now, to reach people that are in these very difficult positions. And I think we've all kind of gotten on board and said, yes, we need to help, we need to minister, we need to reach out to people that are mad, that people that are isolated. So in part of doing that is kind of understanding why they're there. The more I thought about the sermon, I kind of started to think, well, what does it really mean to be mad at God? And if it means we're lost, and I don't have an answer to this question, but I offer it up to you, what it means to be mad at God. The question that then came to my mind was, when we get mad, are we really mad at God? Or are we just mad at a situation? I think back to the times when I thought I was mad at God. When there's a burned 2-year-old in the hospital, I don't know if I'm mad at God or mad at the parents. So I just simply raise that up as a question. Is it really anger at God? I don't know. I do know that God becomes an easy scapegoat for anger. Because God's not somebody that's standing in front of you. God's not somebody that's going to talk back. It's going to engage you in this real physical, visceral altercation, maybe sometimes physical. God isn't. He's just not right here in the form of a person. So sometimes being mad at God becomes a way for us to be mad at something that we feel like we have control over. Is maybe one possibility. The hardest part about reality is that reality is hard. Just think about that for a second. The hardest part about, in another way, real life is that real life is hard. And at church, knowing and understanding that people are in that position, that are tried and kind of drilled into our heads messages of faith, that those don't always resonate with people that are angry and pain-filled and that their world is upside down, it's important for us to understand that and to be mindful of that. And the message of hope that we try to give is that Jesus has always stood in stark contrast to that tragedy. That's the example that we follow. Jesus stood in stark contrast to that darkness and the tragedy. And when we say we're Christians, when we say we follow Christ, it means we have to follow that same pattern of behavior. That when times are tough and when people struggle, we still sit with them. When people are rejected, when people are isolated, we still visit them. When people are lonely, when people are broken, when other religious leaders said, don't touch them, stay away from them, Jesus, you're a heresy, you're doing everything wrong, and Jesus basically said, well, forget you. I'm still going to be with those people. That's what it means to be church. So what do we need to do moving forward, knowing that people are angry, knowing that maybe in your own lives you've had periods where you're angry at God. You don't get it. God, we've done everything right. We don't get it. We've laid these things out. We had this according to our plan. This is what we thought we were doing A, B, C, and D correctly, and yet this situation's unfolded and it's not what we want. It's not what we think you want, God, but it's something totally different. And we're angry about it. I think the first thing to do moving forward is we quit looking, and this is kind of a little soapbox in the middle of the sermon, we've got to quit looking to cities. We've got to quit looking to school districts. We've got to quit looking to the government for answers on the stuff that makes us mad. I think we've got to do a better job of using our faith, even when we are mad. It means a deeper, more connected relationships with the people that we're in relationship with. I would contend that if we have to say that we're Christians to get people to know it, we're not doing it right. People should know we are Christians by our actions. People should know we are people of faith by our love and our compassion. So for me, when we encounter people mad at God, when we're mad at God ourselves, I think it sets up that we either look for outside entities to try to fix these problems so that they don't happen again, or I think that we start with the people that we're in relationship with and we start drawing on those relationships. But that can only happen if we are solid and we're understanding in what people need from those relationships. Because the bottom line is we can't legislate, we can't govern, we can't rule over tragedy or over evil actions. We can't pass laws. We can't tell people not to do it. We can't tell kids, you don't want to commit suicide, you're not sad. You don't feel that way. It doesn't work that way, and it's not true and it's not effective. But yet, we feel like sometimes we can talk people out of things, or that we can pass laws to rule them out. And yet we have to remember we don't have control over anybody else. What makes a difference is our relationships. It's not rules, it's not laws, it's not dictating to somebody else. It's relationship. And Paul is telling us this. When people are lost, when they're mad, he goes to the text and he said, these are things you need to do. Church needs to rise up in the face of tragedy and not shrink away. But it's uncomfortable. When somebody's broken, when somebody's hurting. When I've been mad, I really don't want to share it with anybody else. And yet church should be a place where we want to do the opposite. Church should be a place where it makes people want to draw out that stuff that's cloudy and dark and share it with people because we live the life of followers of Christ. And that's what Paul's telling us. And it doesn't matter if it's a nationally known tragedy or it's a family that's broken, or it's a community lost, the church must be present. We cannot shrink away in the face of tragedy. But at the same time, we cannot politicize and we cannot use tragedy to further our own agendas. Because if we're following Christ, he sure in the heck didn't use the times when people are isolated to build his case. He just went about his life, he lived in relationship and impacted people through love. He didn't use those opportunities to further his own selfish motives because he had none. The things that Paul lays out for us and how we help people that are mad, the first thing he said is restore gently. What Paul is saying there is when tragedy happens or when people are mad, you don't sit with them and tell them everything they've done wrong. You don't sit and critique and criticize and pick apart and try to be the problem solver. Gently means sitting with them, sometimes in silence for hours. Gently means being present. You want to help somebody that's mad. There's been a lot of nights I've come home and Rita's just sat. Sometimes sat for hours. And that's what it takes. Paul tells us we have to be mindful of our own actions. That's what's so important about church. Knowing that not everybody's at the same place on their faith journey. Knowing that the words that initially come to our mind because of our training, because of our understanding, because of our education might be true, but they might not necessarily be comforting in that moment. We have to be mindful of our own actions. Carry each other's burdens is interesting because a little bit later on, Paul says, carry your own burdens. He's got two sides of the same coin right in the same text. Carry your own burdens and carry each other's burdens. What that says to me is relationships are interconnected. Sometimes people need us to sit with them, and yet sometimes we've got to take time and fix our own stuff. Knowing that if it's two sides of the same coin, sometimes fixing our own stuff gives us the ability to help somebody else with theirs. Don't compare to each other. I've heard that an awful lot in my chaplaincy ministry when people try to be helpful. And they say, well, I've lost so-and-so, or this happened to me. In my experience, that typically doesn't come across well. Because people in the midst of being mad, they don't want any comparisons. Because when you're mad, you're broken enough. So sometimes, I know that it comes from a point of trying to be empathetic and helping, but just knowing that your experience might somewhat be comparable to what someone's going through is just good enough for you to sit there and understand what they're going through. It doesn't have to be a tit for tat, kind of, I know how you feel because I went through this. Let your presence be enough is what Paul is saying. Paul tells us to share in the good things. There's always good in the world. As much as we want to be mad, as much as things are bad, when we have those little joys, share them. That's what Paul's saying. People need to know that are lost. Now, they may not want to partake, but the offer is still extended. A good thing might just simply be a cup of coffee, or a meal, or just simply being present. They may decline, but we can never stop sharing the good. Paul reminds us in the text that our actions have consequences. He says you reap what you sow. Sometimes that's the very answer to tragedy. The tragic event is the consequence of somebody's action. What gets hard is when that consequence involves other people that had nothing to do with the original intent. And Paul ends it by saying, we have the opportunity to do good for all people. I think this is really at the very heart of Christianity. God lays out for us, the world lays out for us, reality, although it's hard, lays out for us every single day the ability to do good for somebody else. To do good for all people, in fact. And Paul reminds us of that. Paul kind of really lays out 8 things. So to wrap up, basically you can narrow it down to 3 things that we need to be doing to help those who are mad. We need to support. We need to be willing to evaluate ourselves. And we need to do good. It doesn't get much simpler than that as Christians. I mean, that's a pretty good basis for just Christian living in general. But it gets even more important when people are mad at God. The hardest thing for me has been when I've been mad, I can't find an easy answer. There's no magic cure. There's a ton of books written. You can Google pretty much anything you want to Google. But there is no magic answer for why the bad stuff happens. There's a whole bunch of answers, but there's no one single answer. Because there's no one single answer, I think we need to stop searching for one. And we just need to be present for people. It's called relationships. It's the very reason that we were created as human beings. We were put at the very top of creation because of our intellect, because of the ability that we have to care for one another. I get over being mad at God because of the relationships that I have. That should be the mission, what we endeavor to do. When people are mad at God, make sure that they're not alone. That's being Christ-like. That's what Paul is asking us to do and what he was instructing the church at Galatia. And if we're in relationship long enough, we can help those that are mad at God still see the good in people.